welcome to the Institute. David Rumpf is my name. I'm the director. This is the third and second to last element of our fall program, which unites both the Institute lectures as well as those of the Athenian Friends of the Institute Association. We are very pleased to have Athanasios Sakis Gekas here, and I will introduce him at this point. Sakis did his undergraduate work at the University of in Corfu. He then went on to the University of Essex University for his MA and his PhD. He taught at the London School of Economics and the University of Manchester before going to Canada, where he took up the Modern Greek Studies chair, which is sponsored by the Hellenic Heritage Foundation in Canada. And this is one of three Modern Greek Studies chairs. One is in Montreal at McGill University, the other at York University in Toronto, and the third at Simon Fraser University. And so in this way, slowly Modern Greek Studies is spreading through Canada as an academic discipline. Sakis, I had the pleasure of meeting earlier in the fall. His interest is one that, at least from my limited investigation of the 19th century Greek history, is certainly an interesting one relating to British colonialism in the Mediterranean, the history of the Ionian State, obviously an element of it before being gifted to the Greek nation as a wedding present for George I. He is also, and I find this of equal interest, is looking at 19th century, or what we in history, historians like to talk about long centuries, which take in more than what we think they should take in by our terminology of century. The development of Greece in the 19th century, and it's only, we are, I think, are overwhelmed by the centrality of Athens in the modern Greek state, but in the 19th century Athens was not such a juggernaut of economic and political power as it is now, and so that there, in fact, were competing regional interests involved, both on the political level as well as on the economic level. And so his lecture tonight picks up on, weaves together a series of his research interests relating to the Ionian State, relating to the economic history of Greece, as well as the issues of migration as well, Greek migration. So we are going to be treated to, I think, a topic probably, certainly in English, is very rarely covered here in Athens for sure, and probably in Greece as well. Spanish states, a regional approach to the history of the Greek state in the long 19th century. So Sakis, please come to the floor. I will try not to do anything to your computers. Okay,
thank you all very much. David, thank you very, very much for the introduction, for the invitation. Jonathan, also, I want to thank you for the invitation and the hospitality that you've provided me so far with. It's a great pleasure and an honor to give a lecture here. I want to thank you all for being here, first of all, and apologies for being a little bit late. I was on Skype with Toronto in Canada, and the earliest they could start is 10 o'clock their time. It went on a little bit later than that, 10:30 they started their time. With some colleagues we had an oral examination of a PhD candidate. But I'm very glad to be here, and I'm going to talk about the sort of slightly, as David mentioned, slightly ignored aspect of state formation history. And I'm going to take a regional approach because that's what I've been trained to do, to look at the Ionian Islands state and region as the way to understand better the formation of Greek state and its history during the long, as I call it, 19th century. And I'll come back to the dates. 1912 may seem obvious because that's, you know, the Balkan Wars, which changes everything in excuse me, in the history of Greek state formation. 1798 might be less obvious, but I hope it will become obvious soon enough. Vanished States borrow the title from Norman Davis's excellent book Vanished Kingdoms, in which he, in almost a romantic fashion, goes over a series of kingdoms that were very influential and important, some of them very long-lasting during their time when they existed, but hardly anyone remembers them now. And some of the states I'm going to talk about, most of you will probably know, some of you might have heard about them, but most people don't even know they existed as a state in various forms. And the recent controversy that surrounds Greece has revived debates about the history of Greek state formation. And in the past, historians and social scientists of modern Greece suffered from the backwardness syndrome, as I call it, which is the emphasis how modern, in inverted commas, the Greek state was in comparison to European states, and placed too much emphasis on the success of the nation state after the revolution of 1821. It is often considered and established that 1821 is basically the big bang of modern Greek history. You know, that's when it all started, and that's when it really started for the Greek state. And everything is sort of located and taken on from there. This talk today suggests that we think more broadly, chronologically as well as conceptually, to include various island states, but not insular states, as I will argue, that are now vanished and that formed and were gradually absorbed by the Greek kingdom during the long 19th century. These are the Ionian State, the state of the Principality of Samos, and the Cretan Republic. This regional approach allows us to compare and contrast the various trajectories and regional histories of economies, institutions, and identities, and avoid what is essentially a teleological and homogenized approach to the history of Greek state that argues that, you know, from the center of Athens, from the creation of Athens, and it is changed into the capital of the state, everything changed considerably. And as David very accurately argued, actually, things in the 19th century, I really believe, were very, very different. The history of these states explains the dependencies of modern Greece to colonial empires, not just British, that was mentioned, but also French, Russian, and the Ottoman Empire, during a period of escalating antagonisms in the Mediterranean. And this is where my training also comes from. You know, I never really taught Greek history before going to York and Toronto. You know, in very few places in the UK or elsewhere, modern Greece is taught as a separate course, you know, in its history. Therefore, what I really learned to do and try to do well was to teach the history of the Mediterranean, the history of colonialism in that part of the world. Now, the formation of the Kingdom of Greece is the aberration, I think. You know, the making of a state after a revolution is an aberration, is the exception and not the rule in what happened in the 19th century, because the history of state formation in the whole region of the, let's say, the Eastern Mediterranean proves the gradual transition which was the norm, and often through the process of granting autonomy first, usually as a first step towards a subsequent solution, depending on the international context and the different periods or territorial changes in Europe. So this is what happened mostly in the area where Greece is now, and also elsewhere. You know, some sort of autonomy was granted to a national or an ethnic group. We should more accurately call it that. And then once it became dominant, then it transformed, let's say, into a modern state. Various explanations have been adopted have been used to explain what the Greek state was like. And during clientelism, for example, patronage, the mismanagement of resources, as well as rent-seeking by key economic actors and their political allies, are central explanations in the inability of the Greek state to reform. This is very central in all recent histories, unfortunately, most of them in Greek, that have come out in recent years. You know, the Greek state is always in a perpetual, almost, state of reform. And it's trying to reform, it's doing its best, and this is a discussion, an argument that has come up the last few years as well. You know, the inability to reform, basically, in a simplistic, if you like, way, explains the crisis. You know, this inability of reform and conform to always external models of economic, social, political also behavior. So the Greek state is, the post-revolution state that is an aberration in other fields such as that of political representation. Because it's well known and we're kind of proud about this, that we granted male universal franchise in 1843, confirmed in 1864 in the Constitution, but actually, again, this was an aberration. It was, understandably, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, at least in that respect. But if you ask Ionian Islands Ioannis Zambelios, father of the most important Byzantinist of the 19th century, and protagonist in establishing the continuity of the Greek history, Paparigopoulos followed to a large extent Zambelios, who was a fervent patriot during the War of Independence, fighting for the Greek cause. When a British commander of Lefkada asked him, who should be entitled to vote? The commander was shocked to hear that no agricultural producers should be among those eligible to vote. And this is kind of typical, because most Ionians, because of their trajectory, social, cultural, develop a strong sense of national locality, or local identity if you prefer, that did not translate into democratic sentiments in the way that they were ushered in, if you like, in the post-revolution Greece. Now, what do historians do wrong? Always, self-criticism is always very healthy, I think. If you take historians of art, for example, they have absolutely no problem in when we are discussing figures such as Domingos Theotokopoulos, celebrated a few years from here in the Byzantine Museum, I think, as the first modern Greek painter. This is kind of established among many historians of art, as the first Greek painter, or other literary figures from Crete, such as Vincenzo Kornaros, who are considered the beginners of Greek literature. Dionysios Solomos, for example, is the national poet. We're certainly proud to have him from Zakynthos and Corfu as our national poet. But why are we not prepared? This is the kind of question I would like you to think about. Why are we not prepared to look at the history of the states where these people lived? And some were created before the revolution, as becoming very important over time for the history of the Greek state. And this map, I think, kind of accurately, in a kind of user-friendly way, shows the territorial expansion of Greece, which is very, very conveniently shows also the states I'm going to talk about in the Ionian Islands, Crete, I'm going to talk about a little bit. Samos also, wrongly not painted in a different color for a while. And also one could talk about the state that was going to be created in the area of Smyrna in Ionia. Remember, it was going to be 5 years and then a referendum for the population to decide. That was the plan initially. And of course later on the region of Macedonia, that was not a state, and nevertheless was added, was incorporated in between 1912 and 1923-24 effectively. I think it's fair to say that it lasted for at least 10 years. So the 4 states I'm going to talk about, one comes in 2 versions, under the name Heptanisos Politia, the state of the 7 islands, and then the same islands that were called United States of the Ionian Islands, and contemporaries gave a lot of criticism towards that. That was under British protection, was the most impressive, although not the most long-lived one. And the question is how to write the history of the state, the history not just of the nation state, I think, because we know quite a lot about this, how the nation was educated, how the nation traded, how the nation fought, the wars, but we don't really know the history of public administration. All this boring, almost mundane stuff that really matters. I think, who was building this state? Who was manning its public offices and its civil service? The formation of key documents, such as legal codes, for example, and there has been some work on that from historians of law, the publication of newspapers, state but also regional ones, and the formation of a public policy on infrastructure, health, and the economy. And I think the recent book by Kostas Kostis, History's Spoiled Children, as Zambelius called them, τα κακομαθημένα παιδιά της ιστορίας, actually really looks at very key areas of state policy. But also court records and government and other publications. These are, I think, really important for understanding the logic of these public administrations of these small or larger states. And I think it's quite important to understand how these were absorbed. This is aporophithikon, this is a word we use, rightly or wrongly, we can discuss that, by the Greek state. But I think in many ways it happened the other way around. Some of these states, the Ionian State for example, were really important, and not just self-important, because if you ask many people from Corfu in 1860s, they would be thinking that, okay, the Greek kingdom, the kingdom of Greece, is going to join the Ionian State and not the other way around. But these are all contemporary perceptions, so we shouldn't be fooled by them as historians. But the formation of the three states, of these states in the periphery of Europe, with the Ionian Islands and the Kingdom of Greece, and Samos, which is accurately depicted in this map of the late Ottoman history, these states in the periphery of Europe occurred at the intersection of the expansion of influence of European states and with the Ottoman Empire. Historians have studied these states mostly from an ethnocentric point of view. This is my sort of issue with that. From the point of view of the expansion of the Greek state, so it kind of always expands upwards and eastwards. This is the model. And the issue was certainly one of international relations. We know that, we learn that at school. Who decides what happens with those destitute Greeks who still fight on against Egyptian forces after the Battle of Navarino, and of course it's Russian, British, and to some extent French influence. So we know all that, the fate of these states, when they were created, but we don't know how and who decided how they should vanish, and the fortunes of the people that were determined by the foreign powers. And I think there's a problem with that, because once you explain these, you kind of push aside what happened during a period of 50 years, which is a very long period, especially in the 19th century, or in the case of Samos, 80 years, from 1834 to 1912. Now, the formation of these states, I think, belongs to an old tradition of grandic autonomy out of necessity and diplomatic pragmatism, a flexibility that is exemplified best in the Republic of Ragusa, small but very important, present-day Dubrovnik, and much more well-known, much better known for the Greeks, let's say, the Republic of the Principality, of Wallachia and Moldavia, because that's when the war, supposedly the Greek War of Independence, broke out. Something different happened, but it's still very prominent, not least because of the special status that was granted to members of the Phanary or Greek Orthodox elite to administer them on behalf of the Sultan. And I think we kind of forget that last part of the sentence, we kind of forget that these basically are Ottoman officials. And to use another example, the Patriarch himself is an Ottoman, a high-ranked Ottoman official. Why does he condemn the Greek Revolution? Of course he would. This was going against his master, effectively. Therefore, that didn't save his life, as to be said. Nevertheless, he condemned it as he should have. Now, the whole argument about the gradual disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and its long-lasting decline neglects the fact that for some regions of the empire, some sort of autonomy was the common experience, including the Morea, the Peloponnese, where the revolution broke out. Since 1715, when the Venetians were forced out of the Peloponnese, the Ottomans, in return for the help that local elites provided them to push the Venetians out of the Balkan Peninsula effectively was to grant them some sort of autonomy. And they used it, and I think there's a common pattern with that, if you want to call it a model, I'm not sure I would agree with that, or I wouldn't call it that, but there seems to be a pattern that the more autonomy elites or regions were granted, the more they kept asking for. And I think that's a common element today as well. You know, I don't want to use too many examples from what happens now around the world, but that seems to be, from my understanding, the case. The other reason that Wallachia and Moldavia are well known for is the utopian state that was, you know, the other extreme of what was going on the ground, was conceived by a man who lived and worked in Moldavia and Wallachia, Rigas Fereos. And this was one among several rather utopian and not just romantic plans. I think it's fair to say that it was completely utopian, that were designed at the time. Now, these areas were important for the development of Neo-Hellenic enlightenment and the spread of revolutionary ideas about the nation as a political community in a post-Ottoman world. You know, this is how Rigas understood it to be. And now, these areas were also important for the history of Greek trade, as the 18th century was a century when all Greek companies and commercial networks changed the fortunes and the ideas of many merchants in Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, and around the Mediterranean. So it's kind of established, and we've got a lot of works on that, you know, together with goods, people, and ideas traveled as well, and they were really influential to transfer essentially the ideas of the French Revolution. So we know, as I mentioned before, how the nation was enlightened, how the nation traded, but we don't really know what the impact of these ideas was on state formation, except the argument that sees the diaspora as positive in the 18th century, but not in the 19th. To use a famous phrase by Konstantinos Tsoukalas, the diaspora Greeks who settled in the 1870s, 1880s colonized their own people. You know, this is kind of strong, you know, Marxist approach from the 60s and the 70s mostly, but it still lingers on around the minds of many, many Greek historians. What was going on around Greece at the time? No, that's something terribly different. You know, the period saw the creation of a number of states and the experimentation of various state projects, such as Sicily, which officially came under British control in 1806, remained so until the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and during that time, its governor, Lord Bentinck, set about abolishing feudal privileges and introducing a two-chamber parliament based on the British model. So there's a lot of experimentation going on with different state projects in the region. He dreamt of Sicily becoming a permanent British protectorate. Any similarities with the Ionian Islands are deliberate. With a new constitution, an idea that had great support from many influential Sicilians. In 1815, however, when Napoleon was finally defeated, the island was returned to its Bourbon rulers, only to re-enter the history of national unification later on in the 1840s and 1860s especially onwards. So this is the reason why 1798 is the beginning of the period in the title. I think the Greek states are basically a product of the Napoleonic Wars. And they are not in just vague general sense that it all goes back to the French Revolution, of course it does, but in a much more specific sense in the approach that was taken to state formation, in the policies and practices adopted by French, British, to some extent Russian, who shouldn't be dismissed, although they stayed for a very small period on the Ionian Islands, but they were there and they were introducing these modernizing policies. So, and the starting point is not really the Greek Revolution, but the arrival of Napoleon in Egypt. And the reason for that is that it best explains the incorporation of the Ionian Islands under the French Republican, as it is called, rule. When Napoleon admired his achievement and he publicized it that now we hold the Ionian Islands, which are more important than Italy, he actually wrote that. This was not because they were important per se, but because they were important on the route to Egypt and from then on to the Middle East and India, which was not called Middle East at the time, but nevertheless. So the scramble between France, Britain, Russia and the Ottoman Empire for the Eastern Mediterranean intensified during the Napoleonic Wars. So it's not really, if you like, the Orlov rebellion that drove, that invited initially the Russians into the Peloponnese and the Aegean, and then of course they left, leaving the area to chaos. But it was actually the Napoleonic Wars that brought the French, the British especially, and the Russians into the region. All of course at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. The French didn't stay very long in the first instance in the Ionian Islands because the Russian and Turkish fleet, the most unholy alliance probably of the early modern period, occupied the Ionian Islands and drove the French out, which by then were not really popular anyway because they were atheists. They imposed the French revolutionary customs and heavy taxation, always something that upsets the locals back then as well as today. The French in 1797 inherited the islands together with the Republic of Venice. That's how they got the islands, of course. And the long period of rule of Venetian rule in Corfu left a lasting impact on the island's institutions, class relations, architecture, language and culture. And this is all pretty much known. However, it still lacks being incorporated and introduced into the history of the Greek state. And it simply cannot be overestimated how big this impact was, and historians of the Ionian Islands have been very good to explain the diverse trajectory of the island's history, which can still be seen today. For everyone of you who has visited, especially Corfu, it doesn't really take much to imagine how things were back then. Although it has to be said that the British period kind of gets a little bit lost. Everybody talks about the Venetian Corfu and all that. Nobody really talks about British Corfu as it should be. Immediately after the French left, the state of the Seven Islands, or Heptanisos Politia, was created explicitly in the model, following the model of the Republic of Ragusa. This is why I mentioned it earlier, because it served as a model, the jewel of the Adriatic, as Fernand Blondel has called it. The merchant city-state republic, that's what it was independent with a great degree of autonomy, and despite its motto, Libertas, Ragusa was always a tributary state, or a protectorate, and enjoyed Venetian protection until the 14th century, Hungarian and Austrian sovereignty later on, until it was jointly controlled by Ottomans and the Austrian throne. So the model of the Septinsular Republic generated in Russia expectations of state building in the Adriatic and the Western Balkans. So I think after the failed Orlov rebellion, which was not very organized anyway, this sort of project of state formation brings the Russians much more effectively and for a period of 7 years into the region. This is also the period when many of the institutions that we see later on in the British protectorate of the Ionian Islands came into life. Not only legal, such as the 1803 Constitution, which is the model for British High Commissioner Maitland's constitutional charter in 1817, but also because it is the first state that writes in Greek and also makes a specific provision that the language of the state should be Greek. It is also the first time that the Ottomans created the term Cumhuriyet, this is republic, before the Greek state succeeded its struggle for independence. Ionians, let's not forget them, educated in Italian universities, mostly Padova, in law and medicine, were qualified to form a political personnel and, most importantly, an efficient bureaucracy, not to mention other than Kapodistrias himself. He is the one, among many others, who trained in the art and science by the time of politics during the period of the Septinsular Republic, before going off to his international and acclaimed career. It is also important to mention that the Septinsular state was created under the auspices of the Sultan, and this is why a model that resembled the Danubian principalities and the Ragusan state was invented to suit the Ionian particularities. So we see what basically I want you to take from this sort of brief story of the Septinsular Republic is that the leaders and empires of the time show a great degree of flexibility. of adapting to local conditions in the national relations, until the Greek Revolution happened. This distinct historical trajectory, however, of the Ionian Islands is, compared to the rest of the world, of the Greek world, is what distinguishes later on as well. The fact that they were a federal state, and it was this federalization process accelerated after 1800 and after the coming of British rule. However, there were differences among the islands under Venetian and subsequent rule that gradually amalgamate as the state takes shape. For instance, there's a very simple example: no judge should serve on his own island. Okay, this is something new. There was no provision for that during the Venetian period, for example. This political and cultural unity is similar, of course, to the mainland and other islands, but I think there are significant differences that were gradually masked under this federal state. There are many issues about Ionian consciousness, regional identity. A colleague the other day was asking me, I really want to see and talk about with people who study the history of the Ionian Islands, to what extent, under what sort of identity do Ionians fight together with the Greeks in the war of independence? You know, they're not diaspora, or are they? They are not fighting for a revolution on their own islands. You know, they're going somewhere else across the Ionian Sea to fight. And I think beyond that, national or identity, original identity, the main issue that we tend to forget is that the most important marker of identity in the Ionian Islands is if you are from the town, especially from Corfu, or from a village. You know, that distinguishes them, and that's something that barely exists in the Peloponnese or other parts of the Ottoman world. And this is how the Ionian fusion, as I call it, most evident in the flag of the Ionian State, came into life. The United States of the Ionian Islands, as it was officially called. What's most important, I think, towards the end of the period and led into the history of the Ionian Island and the Kingdom of Greece becoming one state is the force of liberalism. And this is the best example that I have found that proves what I mentioned earlier, that the more autonomy and the more reforms or liberal politics one introduced into their territory, such as Lord High Commissioner Seaton in 1848, the more people are going to ask for. You know, they gave them elections, freer elections, and not universal male suffrage, of course, and newspapers. The next High Commissioner had to shut down 3 of them very, very quickly after the 3rd or 4th issue, because they were so so vocal against the British regime and the Queen herself and the whole empire, even at some points, that the commissioner had no other option, he thought at least, from shutting them down. These kind of political contradictions, effectively, the protected independence. You know, this is Article number 1 of the Constitution of the Treaty of Paris that gave the Ionian Islands to Britain. The islands are going to form an independent state under the exclusive and immediate protection of His Majesty the King of Britain. You know, it's difficult to overemphasize the contradiction in the phrase. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was kind of the norm at the time, and not to have revolutions and other destabilizing events. So this was a protected independence, there's no doubt about this. Gradually, it became an autocratic rule, depending on which commissioner you had, under a strong state with a facade of independence, and that's cultivated during the period. The modernizing project and reforms that were introduced do matter, because they changed the attitude of Ionians, depending on which class they belonged, of course, towards the commissioners. And as I mentioned earlier, the failed reforms of 1849 failed because their aim was to legitimize the regime and stop Ionians from complaining about British rule. Led to by the 1850s, the islands becoming ungovernable. Not even Gladstone himself could find a solution, you know, when he was sent the special High Commissioner to the islands, and as David mentioned, they were gifted, they were given as a gift in 1864, I think very conveniently for British interest in the Mediterranean. King Otto was dethroned, deposed, and a new monarch had to be found for Greece. Still, the areas I think that are important to consider when studying the history of the state is the construction of roads and water supplies, but also the two palaces and residences in Corfu that really show the considerations, the priorities, and the policies of these administrations. In the 1830s, public buildings, markets, courts really changed the outlook, but also the function of Ionian cities, and it's important to keep that in mind. 1840s, more establishments of modernity appear on the islands, especially in Corfu and Kefalonia. Prison, the lunatic asylum, as it was called, the exchange and chamber of commerce. And then by the 1850s, you see when money runs out that the Ionian state is no longer able to keep up to its promise, to its modernizing promise on the islands. The roads are in a state of disrepair. There is a significant crisis and outbreak of disease also. The Crimean War makes matters even worse, and the Ionian economy did not recover until the 1860s, which I think led to a crisis of legitimacy, or accelerated one, both in the Ionian Islands and the Greek state, and that gradually led to the revolution, as it's called, against Otto in 1862. Now, another state that barely mentioned in the region, and it's a state in inverted commas. Okay, I mean it's like the ISIS today, they call it Islamic State. I mean, it's certainly not a state in the Weberian sense. Okay, it's certainly not that. Maybe it's a state in a sort of medieval or barbaric sense, but it's definitely not a European or modern state. Similarly, the state that tried, that Ali Pasha, the Muslim Bonaparte, as Catherine Fleming has called him, the state that Ali Pasha tried to create, is barely mentioned, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that Ioannis Koletis, Ali Pasha's doctor, trained also and used some of Ali Pasha's shrewdness later on as a Greek prime minister, and a very influential one under King Otto. I'm not going to mention too much about him. I think it's the state, or let's say quasi-state of Ali Pasha, and its trajectory should not be underestimated, since even the Philikieteria, the most organized revolutionary secret society, communicated with him, discussed the project of coming into an arrangement in a post-Ottoman, post-Sultan, definitely space, and it was this decision of Mahmud II to take out Ali and his power that shattered such plans. Not that they were going to be realized, but nevertheless that was the reality until 1820. But it also, his state and his power sparked the war of revolution of independence itself, and helped it, since most of the Sultan's army moved from the Morea to Epirus to face Ali, just a testament of his military capacity. And this perhaps explains partly the failure of the Philikieteria to play any significant role in the struggle once the war started. You could say that among other factors, of course, they had put all their cards on Ali's license to form some sort of state under, perhaps even French sovereignty in the area of Peloponnese and generally what is today southern Greece. Now, the most important state in the region at the time is, of course, not the Ionian State, obviously, but the state that Muhammad Ali was creating in Egypt. And it's very important, not least because Napoleon went there first, but it's because of his son's campaign in Morea that nearly killed, and we can safely assume perhaps that it would have killed off the Greek Revolution had the Battle of Navarino not taken place. And I think that's another, this Egyptian aspect of Greek history is also very rarely mentioned, but I think it's very, very important. Not least because in return for his services or for his help to the Sultan, Muhammad Ali and his son personally received Crete as a token of appreciation. Now, Crete being the only colony of the small empire that Mehmet Ali was building. The Egyptian rule on the island lasted until the 1840s, and Muhammad Ali later went on to challenge the authority of the Sultan, not once but twice, in the 1830s and again in the 1840s. What stopped him was another unholy alliance of Russia with the Sultans in the first instance, and the British army, of all armies, that came to the Sultan's rescue in the second instance, when Britain was more committed to the principle of support to the Ottoman Sultan than to Muhammad Ali, and who they thought they could not control. Therefore, Egypt's modernizing, as I called, reforms, somehow controversially, we had Crete as a field of experimentation with the organization of public order, sanitation, public health, immunization. You have introduced to the island for the first time, and even the publication of a newspaper, of a state newspaper, the Vakayi Giridige, as was called, the Cretan newspaper. One of the first, actually, in the Ottoman Empire, was published for a few years in Crete. We only have a few of its issues that survived, unfortunately. The Battle of Navarino changed everything. I don't need to go over too many details on that, but it's really brought into the forefront Kapodistrias, the famous Ionian, who was no dreamer, of course, like Rigas, who was trained in the pragmatism of politics during his term as a young minister, and he tried to keep the agreement to the benefit of Greece that was made between the great powers, who selected a king for the new state once Kapodistrias was assassinated. Kapodistrias, of course, did what he knew best. He ruled Greece in the way other states at the time were governed, an enlightened, paternalistic rule, often called authoritarian, and not under a constitutional rule that many revolutionary intellectuals had hoped and fought for. And this was actually part of the problem. But the main problem was the inability of Kapodistrias to convince people who were very powerful during the War of Independence that it was really worth giving up some of the power that they already had before the revolution and acquired during the war, that it was really worth giving up some of that power for something grander, such as building a state. The events in the 1870s, 80s, I have to move on quite quickly, are really the change of events, the change of events that led to the history of Greek state formation much closer to the island of Crete. I mean, Crete overall in the 19th century plays at key moments a very crucial role because it brought Greece into a confrontation, often very unsuccessful, with the Ottoman Empire. And you can still, give them some credit for trying. You still think that the Ottoman Empire is not just a very powerful empire, but it's actually modernizing in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century. It really takes some guts for the Greek state at the time to try and challenge and take some territory, such as the area of Epirus and Thessaly in 1881, to take some of the territory of the Ottomans with a very, very weak army. And that, of course, came into reality. Everyone understood that in the so-called failed war or futile war for others of 1897. However, the island of Crete has its history of its own, obviously, and it's first and foremost a representative Mediterranean paradigm in the Brodelian sense, with all the elements of a typical, let's say, Mediterranean island. But the economic parameters that are usually employed to describe the Mediterranean region, let's say cultivation, trade, piracy, migration, these are sort of the categories for early modern Mediterranean, seem to break down when it comes to Crete in the 19th century. And I think there's something fundamentally different about that. It's not a typical large island that grows crops for the purpose of nourishment and clothing, let's say. But it's a central issue, in fact, of Greece's modern history, the history of the large and self-sustained island of Crete, that in the period 1780, 1878, 1889, during the Halepa era, as it's called. It seems to have changed under the Ottoman reform process, and to have come into a conclusion with 1898 Ottoman administration and the departure of Ottoman troops, which changed really the history of the island. This forced intervention of foreign powers, mainly Britain, again, was sparked by a new revolution of the Christian Cretans. This is the most accurate description. There are people in Crete who were Christian and Muslim. I mean, Turkish is used much later in a much more specific way, which was crushed by the Ottoman army, which by that time it makes no effort to conceal its imposing abilities. And the atrocities by the Ottoman army and irregulars, who feel that they have to stay more and more in the cities to be protected by the Ottoman army. So there's again a rural-urban divide and cleavage between the two communities in Crete over time during the 19th century. The great powers intervened and obliged the Sultan, again as in the 1820s, to ensure the Christians' political rights by way of constitution this time, things have moved on, the so-called Memorandum of Halepa. The historical given, of course, in the post-Tanzimat period is the persistent weakening of the administrative model of the Ottoman Empire. This is what's happened during the period. A process that began before the Berlin Congress of 1878, a decline particularly evident at the periphery of the empire, as in the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1878, and the intensification of tendencies towards self-rule, in particular island regions such as Samos and Crete. Now, Samos was not part of the Greek state, neither was part entirely, or as before 1820, of the Ottoman Empire. So it became a principality when the last Phanariots were appointed as governors, as princes, and therefore it kept its own special regime. The events in 1898, however, were very important because it invited the Berlinization of Crete. The Crete was divided into five regions, with the English who took Iraklio, the Russians took Rethymno, or controlled, more accurately. The Italians appear as a new empire in the Mediterranean, took Chania. The Germans, of course, by the late 19th century, Suda, and the French, Scythia, the eastern part of the island. Greece was forced to withdraw with the little forces that they had sent, and the Cretan rebels were forced to put their arms on the side, and Venizelos played a big role of it. Also minted in the art of politics on an island that was enjoying this special status, pre-revolution, or post-revolution, but not yet independent, before going on to become the Venizelos that we know and many admire of 1910 onwards. And evident, the presence of British protection in Iraklio in 1900, the British flag, you couldn't see it in many other parts of Greece at the time. But the Cretan state, or Kritiki Politia, as is more accurate, or republic if you like, but I think Cretan state translates more accurately what was going on. Officially between 1898 and 1912 or 13, if you want to be more accurate, shows the best contradiction that they could come up with in a flag. The Greek flag with the star and the red square on the top left corner. However, this state had to create some institutions, despite the fact that it was very short-lived. They did try to create, first of all, to take care of law and order. The gendarmerie of the Cretan state, here showing their support for Greece. There was proportions that they were given, percentages to Muslims and Christians. Christians, of course, being the majority of the population. We received more places in the local administration, in the police forces, trained by the Italians, for example, and so on. There is no doubt, however, that the process of Hellenization of the island, that started during the period, intensified after the island became part of Greece, and as in so many other parts of Greece that were Ottoman, the Hellenization took a very, very specific form that meant destroying, eradicating, if you like, the past. Not least in places like Athens, for instance, but also in Macedonia at the same time, and not that Bulgarians did something different, okay, or the Serbians. I mean, there's not a typical Greek characteristic. Therefore, in the period of consolidation of the country's national identity and territory is, I think, the long 19th century, defined by geography and culture, but also by the British role in the Mediterranean. The challenge for the Greek state was constantly to integrate different regions, especially its islands, and this was the two sides, or the other side, of the Megali Idea, territorial expansion and economic development. And this is in fact the main problem that Trikoupis especially failed to solve. He tried to square the circle, as we say in Greek, but I think it was impossible at the time. However, the area I'm very keen on, and I'm going to be finishing with that, because it's almost 45 minutes we're talking, the area I think is mostly important to consider, and it's a very good example actually, is banking. Again, we tend to forget how people used to bank in the past, but the role of financial institutions and the role in the economy is, I think, one of the most important for understanding the creation of a national economy. And as someone has said, and I remember, you can't have a state without a flag and a currency. And the first banks that appeared in the Greek and Ionian economies, the National Bank and the Ionian Bank, the Bank of Crete came later, of course, they aimed primarily at the privilege of issuing banknotes and funding commerce. So they fueled, if you like, the Greek economy and through credit and commerce. The relationship of the Greek state and National Bank has been very well written and discussed, and the two grew coincidentally, if you like. But the cost of integration seems to have increased with every expansion of national borders. The Ionian and Epiro-Thessalia Bank, there was one of them too, had the privilege to issue banknotes and reap mutual benefits within a given territory. This is something we call it today the Eurozone, for instance, but this used to happen elsewhere. And of course, very difficult to contain currencies from slipping into national borders. That's how economies work. But nevertheless, it's important that they had the privilege to issue notes over a particular geographical, essentially state or regional territory. Now, of course, these banks took over the obligation to guarantee domestic borrowing to the government, and this was the trade-off, something that sounds very up-to-date now, but this is how the Ionian Bank funded the Ionian State debt, for example, that was given also to the Greek state when the two islands joined. The National Bank of Greece was funding the governments for for decades actually. Greece remained off the markets, as we say today, between effectively 1830s and 1879. So for nearly 40 years, Greece did not borrow from international, from British and French banks, essentially. Samos, I'm not going to talk much about, but it's almost exotic. I think nobody talks about Samos, but it's very interesting if you look at the archive, which has been saved and now already being digitized by someone, by Christos Landros, who did excellent work, is now retired, on the archive of Samos, but I think it has something to say about the cases of these islands or these small regions that, because of conflicting interests, but also very local pressures, they managed to maintain some sort of autonomy for, as I said, for 70 years. In the case of Samos, determined to some extent the other island state and region Crete, which functioned also as an autonomous state from 1898-1912. So despite its size, Samos became the sort of model in the minds of Ottomans and others, of what they're going to do about Crete. Because Samos didn't have the tensions between Christians and Muslims that Crete had, but they did not have much more to borrow from. other models to borrow from. Therefore, Samos became autonomous under the sovereignty of the Sultan, but all Ottoman troops would evacuate the island and substituted by a home guard, this is very important, and the island was obliged to pay a yearly tribute and held the right to have its own flag, raised by Fanariot Konstantinos Moussos on 12 May 1834. The flag symbolized the Greek character of the island with a white triangle in the center, symbolizing also the protection of the island by Britain, France and Russia. And to conclude, a regional approach to state and national economy formation, the gradual emergence of the public economy, state finances at the time, in the post-revolution state territory is being researched and we know quite a lot about. The law and institutions and the regional path dependence of markets and networks is also something that Greek historians and political economists, you could say, since Pepelassis in the 1950s, have said how important they are. But how the two issues were conflated or even clashed every time a new territory was added to the new state is what I think we really need to know more about. The constitution of the Ionian State, of the Peninsular Republic, as it was called, for instance, as a constitution that in Italian says that the language of the state should be Greek. I think it shows how things change very, very rapidly at the time, not managing to catch up with the text. The documents are not catching up with society. Essentially, we're talking about the origins of political and legal institutions. Are they economic or are they political? The origins of state formation, and this is, depends who you ask, historians or political scientists. Where did the legal framework come from and how did it develop? And we know quite a lot about this, especially when it comes to the legislation that was adopted by the Greek state. It was the Commercial Code, the Napoleonic Code. However, recently historians are looking at how the law applied, how the law was practiced in the courts through court records, and they find very interesting things. For example, that the place of women in post-Ottoman Greek state society was probably even worse. You could say that it was before the revolution. Of course, we tend to celebrate the people who were very important, I think, and they came from these island states. We tend to celebrate their presence in various ways. This is not an argument about returning to the drachma, okay? I should not be misunderstood here. This is an example of how Capodistria has become emblematic. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the long 19th century that saw Greece increase its population and territory by 70% after the Balkan Wars at the expense of the Ottoman Empire raises the main question of how modern the Greek state compared to others was, but not only that, how the state was built and worked in Greece and who also built the state. In many ways, I think we cannot possibly talk about the state and what it means while ignoring the basic mechanisms that constituted the institutions that forged a national economy, other than the education, the army, and the political participation that was absolutely important. But historians have already said this. What we need to find is, or invent, the tools for reading the dynamic of state transformations of these island states that haven't been ignored by Greek historiography, even though they constitute the necessary conditions for understanding the state itself. And it's also a matter to consider that a Greek unification project was perhaps the Megali idea wasn't realistic, but it was considered one of the driving principles behind this national state formation. The regions such as the Ionian Islands, Crete, Samos and Macedonia, we know quite a lot about Macedonia, but not really enough. Once we know how the states were incorporated and merged with the Greek state, then perhaps we will stop looking only at the impact of the Megali idea and the military campaigns that created the nation state and learn what was actually involved in building a state and a national economy. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions.